The groan of steel on the steel was the final sound of a world she had once known. For 3 days, that relentless rhythm had been the metronome of Mary Louise Whitmore's shrinking life, counting down the miles that separated her from the manicured lawns and quiet sorrows of Massachusetts. When the train finally hissed to a stop, the silence that followed was more jarring than the noise. It was a dead, dry silence, filled only with the whisper of a wind that carried grit instead of the scent of the sea. She clutched her worn reticule, the single letter inside feeling as heavy as a brick. It was a letter of promise, a lifeline from a Mr. Colt McGraw, offering a position as a bookkeeper on his sprawling Wyoming ranch, a respectable job, a new start, a chance to be more than the orphaned daughter of a failed merchant, a burden to her distant relatives. At 19, Mary Louise had believed in the power of ink on paper, in the integrity of a man's written word. Taking a deep breath, she descended the steep steps of the passenger car, her dark wool traveling dress already an insult to the blistering sun. The heat was a physical blow. It struck her through the fabric, leaching the moisture from her skin, making the starched collar of her blouse feel like a chokehold. And then there was the dust. It wasn't the polite dust of Boston streets. This was a thick, red powder that coated everything with a film of rust. It swirled from the unpaved street, stirred by the boots of men who looked as though they'd been carved from the unforgiving landscape itself. Red Mesa, Wyoming. The name on the letter had sounded romantic. The reality was a handful of weathered, false-fronted buildings huddled together against an endless, empty sky, as if for protection. Her appearance on the platform caused a subtle shift in the town's languid rhythm. Conversations paused, heads turned, eyes hard, curious, and overwhelmingly male took her in from the tip of her modest bonnet to the scuffed toes of her leather boots. She was an anomaly, a splash of dark, Eastern propriety in a world of sun-bleached denim and sweat-stained felt. She felt their gazes like insects crawling on her skin, assessing her, judging her, and finding her wanting. The women she saw, standing in the doorways of the general store or the saloon, had faces like leather and hands that looked strong enough to wring a man's neck. Their expressions were even less charitable than the men's, a mixture of pity and contempt. Mary Louise pulled her shawl tighter. Despite the heat, a useless gesture of self-preservation. She scanned the small crowd for someone who might be Mr. McGraw. The letter had said he would meet her. She expected a man of ledgers and figures, perhaps a bit weathered, but with the soft hands of a gentleman rancher. She saw no one of that description. There were rough-edged prospectors, their eyes wild with the hope of gold, gaunt-faced farmers whose dreams had clearly dried up with the soil, and cowboys, lean and dangerous, who moved with a predatory grace she found both fascinating and terrifying. Then a man detached himself from the shadows of the station master's office. He wasn't what she had expected at all. He was tall, broader in the shoulder than any 2 men she'd known back home, and he moved with a quiet authority that made the dust itself seem to settle in his wake. His face was a landscape of its own, tanned and lined by sun and wind, with a square jaw shadowed by a day's worth of stubble. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were fixed on her, missing nothing. He wore no suit, just dark, hard-wearing trousers, a plain shirt, and a leather vest. A gun belt was slung low on his hips, the pistol it held looking less like an accessory and more like a part of him. This was not a man of ledgers. This was a man of land and livestock, of hard decisions made under an unforgiving sun. He stopped a few feet from her. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was a low baritone, a gravelly sound that seemed to fit the parched land. Mary Louise swallowed, her throat suddenly as dry as the street. "Yes, I am she. Are you Mr. McGraw?" "I am." He gave a curt nod, his gaze sweeping over her once more. A swift, comprehensive inventory. He seemed to take in her youth, her fine-boned fragility, and the tremor in her hands. A flicker of something doubt, perhaps, or resignation crossed his features before being locked away. "You travel light." He gestured to her single, small trunk being unloaded from the baggage car. "It is all I have, sir," she said, her voice smaller than she intended. Colt McGraw said nothing more. He simply picked up her trunk with one hand as if it weighed nothing, his other gesturing toward a buckboard wagon hitched nearby. The ride to the McGraw ranch was conducted in a silence that stretched as vast as the plains around them. Mary Louise, perched on the hard wooden seat, tried to find something to say, some pleasantry to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. The sheer scale of the country had stolen them. Back east, the world was a collection of contained spaces, parlors, gardens, towns nestled in green valleys. Here, there was no containment. The sky was an immense, achingly blue dome that dwarfed the land, and the land itself rolled on forever in waves of sagebrush and prairie grass, broken only by distant, haze-shrouded mountains. It was beautiful, but it was a cruel, indifferent beauty. There was no place to hide. A person could get lost out here, she thought, not just in body, but in soul. Colt seemed perfectly at home in the emptiness. He handled the reins with an easy, practiced economy of motion, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon. Once, he pointed with his chin. "Antelope." He said. Mary Louise saw a flicker of tan movement in the distance. And then it was gone. The single word was the entirety of their conversation for the first hour. She stole glances at him. He was not an old man, perhaps 35, but there was a weariness in his eyes that spoke of a much longer, harder life. She noted the faded band of lighter skin on his ring finger. A widower. Then, the letter had mentioned nothing of his personal life, only the ranch and the duties required. She clung to that. Duties she could manage. Bookkeeping was a world of order and sense, of debits and credits that always had to balance. It was a comfort in this wild, unbalanced land. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they crested a low rise, and the McGraw ranch spread out before them. It was a small empire carved out of the wilderness. A long, sturdy ranch house, built of timber and stone, stood at the center, flanked by a massive barn, several corrals, and a handful of smaller outbuildings. Smoke curled from the stone chimney of the main house, a lonely plume against the vast sky. It was impressive, a testament to wealth and hard work. Yet it had a stark, unadorned quality. It was a place of function, not of comfort. Colt pulled the wagon to a halt before the house. As he helped her down, his hand enclosed hers for a brief moment. It was rough and calloused, but the grip was steady, surprisingly gentle. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. Perhaps this could work. Perhaps she could find her place here. He led her inside. The main room was vast, dominated by a stone fireplace big enough to roast an ox. A long dining table with 10 chairs sat on one side, and a few leather armchairs were grouped near the hearth. The furniture was solid and well made, but there were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the planked floor, no pictures on the walls. It was clean, but it was the sterile cleanliness of a barracks. Not a home. The air felt still and silent, heavy with unspoken loss. "I'll have your trunk brought in," Colt said, setting his hat on a peg by the door. "Would you care for some water?" "Yes, please." He ladled some from a bucket into a tin cup and handed it to her. It was cool and clean, and she drank it gratefully. As she lowered the cup, she decided to broach the subject that had brought her all this way. "Mr. McGraw," she began, trying to inject a professional tone into her voice. "I am most eager to begin my duties. If you could show me the ledgers and where you would like me to work, I can start at once." Colt McGraw didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the fireplace, his back to her, and rested one arm on the mantel. The silence stretched, thick with a tension she didn't understand. "The ledgers are in order. Miss Whitmore," he said finally, his voice low and flat. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. There is no bookkeeping job. The tin cup slipped from Mary Louise's fingers, clattering loudly on the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the still room. I don't understand, she stammered, her heart beginning to pound a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. The letter was a means to get you here, he said, his voice devoid of apology. It was a simple statement of fact. A cold dread washed over her, chilling her despite the oppressive heat of the room. Her mind raced, conjuring all the terrible stories she had heard about the West, about foolish girls lured from their homes for unspeakable purposes. The judgmental stares in town, the stark emptiness of this house, it all clicked into a terrifying new context. "What is this?" Then she whispered, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Why have you brought me here?" Colt's gaze did not waver. It held hers, direct and unflinching. "My wife, Sarah, died 2 years ago. A riding accident. Since then, this house has been empty. I have a niece, Abigail. Her parents, my brother and his wife, were taken by fever last winter. She's 7 years old, and she needs more than I can give her, more than a ranch full of cowboys can give her." He took a step toward her, and she flinched back. He stopped, a muscle tightening in his jaw. "I need a wife, Miss Whitmore. I need a woman to make this house a home again. I need a mother for a little girl who has lost everything. The letter was a lie. I'll grant you that. But it was the only way I knew to bring a decent woman out to this godforsaken place without her being judged a common saloon girl from the moment she stepped off the train." The breath left Mary Louise's body in a rush. A wife. He had brought her here to be his wife. The shock was so profound it left her dizzy. She felt a wave of indignation, of hot, furious betrayal. He had deceived her, tricked her, treated her like a piece of livestock to be ordered and shipped. "How dare you?" she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "You lied to me. You dragged me halfway across the country under false pretenses. I came here for a position, for honest work, not to be auctioned off." "There is no auction," he said calmly, though his eyes had hardened. "It's a proposal, a practical arrangement." "Practical," she cried, laughing a sharp, hysterical sound. "You know nothing about me, I know nothing about you. This is barbaric." "This is the West, Miss Whitmore," he retorted, his voice taking on a hard edge. "We don't have time for months of courting and poetry. We have lives to build and children to raise. I'm offering you a home, a name, protection. In return, I ask that you be a wife to me and a mother to my niece. You will want for nothing." Her fury began to crumble, replaced by the cold, stark reality of her situation. He was right. This was the West, and she was alone. She had no money, no friends, and the return ticket in her reticule was a useless piece of paper. The family who had sent her away with quiet relief would not welcome her back. She had nowhere to go. The vast, indifferent wilderness she had seen from the wagon was all that awaited her if she walked out that door. She was trapped, as surely as if he had put her in chains. Tears of frustration and despair welled in her eyes. "You cheated me," she whispered, the fight draining out of her. For the first time, a shadow of something other than pragmatism crossed his face. "It might have been regret. Perhaps I did," he admitted, his voice softening slightly. "But I am an honest man in all other things. I am giving you an honest choice now." He looked at her, standing there in the middle of his empty, echoing house, a fragile piece of the East that the West was about to swallow whole. Her shoulders slumped, the weight of her impossible circumstances pressing down on her. "The choice is yours, Miss Whitmore. No one will force you. There's a stagecoach that passes through Red Mesa twice a week. I will pay your fare back to wherever you wish to go. You have my word on that." He paused, letting the offer hang in the air before delivering the alternative. "Or you can stay." He swept a hand around the room, a gesture that encompassed not just the house, but the thousands of acres that surrounded it, the herds of cattle, the entire world he had built. "You can leave any time, but if you stay, this will be your home." Mary Louise did not leave. The choice, when it came down to it, was no choice at all. To return east was to embrace a slow, genteel starvation of spirit, to become a permanent shadow in the corner of some cousin's parlor. To stay in Wyoming was to face a terror of the unknown, but it was a terror that held, however faintly, the possibility of life. She chose life, or at least the chance of it. Her new existence began not with a wedding vow, but with the tyranny of a cast-iron cook stove. Back in Massachusetts, the kitchen had been the domain of a hired cook. Mary Louise's knowledge of preparing a meal was purely theoretical. The stove in the McGraw Ranch house was a black, hulking beast that demanded tribute in the form of kindling and wood, and it met her first attempts with belligerent puffs of thick, acrid smoke that sent her stumbling out the back door, coughing and weeping with frustration. Her hands, accustomed to needlepoint in the smooth keys of a pianoforte, were soon stained with soot and pricked with splinters. The first breakfast she attempted to make for the ranch hands was an unmitigated disaster. The biscuits were as hard as river stones. The bacon was a mess of charred strips and flaccid, undercooked fat, and the coffee was a watery, bitter brew. The cowboys, a dozen lean, sun-scorched men, filed in at dawn and took their seats at the long table in silence. They looked at the plates she set before them, then at each other. One of them, a young man with a thatch of red hair, poked a biscuit with his fork. It skittered off his plate and clattered onto the floor. A deep, rumbling chuckle came from the head of the table. It was Jedediah Jed Boone, the ranch foreman. He was a man who seemed to be made of leather and gristle, with pale, assessing eyes that missed nothing. He was Colt's most trusted man, and his skepticism of Mary Louise was a palpable force in the room. "Looks like we're in for some lean times, boys," Jed drawled, not unkindly, but with a clear amusement that made Mary Louise's cheeks burn with shame. He stood up, took the skillet from her unresisting hand, and in a matter of minutes had a fresh batch of bacon sizzling and coffee that smelled rich and invigorating. He didn't say a word to her, an omission that was more damning than any insult. He simply fixed the problem she had created, highlighting her utter uselessness. Colt, who had watched the entire exchange from the doorway, said nothing. His silence was a heavy blanket. After the men had eaten and departed for the day's work, he gestured to the plate she had prepared for him, which sat untouched. "Eat," he said. It wasn't a request. She forced down a bite of the leathery bacon, the shame a bitter taste in her mouth. This was her reality now. She was not a bookkeeper, not a lady of any standing. She was a failure who couldn't even manage the most basic of domestic tasks. Her days fell into a rhythm of humbling education. She learned that milking a cow was not a gentle, pastoral activity, but a battle of wills against a 1,000-pound creature that could crush her foot with a careless step. She learned to knead dough until her arms ached, to pluck a chicken, to mend denim trousers worn thin by the saddle, to tell the difference between the scent of rain on the wind and the smell of dust that signaled another dry day. Every task was a mountain to be climbed, and every evening she fell into her bed, a small, Spartan room at the opposite end of the house from Colt's, with an exhaustion so deep it felt like it had settled in her bones. And then there was Abigail. The child was a ghost in the house, a small, silent creature with Colt's stormy gray eyes and a solemnity that was unnatural in a 7-year-old. She moved with a quiet, watchful grace, always on the periphery. She would appear in doorways, observing Mary Louise's struggles in the kitchen, her expression unreadable. She spoke only to her uncle, and even then in whispers. She was a locked box to which Mary Louise had no key. Mary Louise tried. She offered a smile, which was met with a blank stare. She tried to speak to her, asking about her doll, a button-eyed rag figure she carried everywhere. But Abigail would only clutch it tighter and shrink away. The girl was a living, breathing symbol of Mary Louise's inadequacy. She had been brought here to be a mother to this child, and she couldn't even elicit a single word. The chasm between them felt as vast and uncrossable as the prairie itself. The social isolation was just as profound. A week after her arrival, Colt needed to ride into Red Mesa for supplies. "You should come," he'd stated. "People should see you." The stares she had received on her first day were nothing compared to the reception she got now. The initial curiosity had curdled into a knowing, disdainful judgment. As she walked beside Colt down the dusty main street, she felt the weight of whispers and sideways glances. The women, in particular, looked her up and down with open contempt. In the general store, while Colt negotiated the price of flour with the proprietor, Mary Louise overheard two women talking near a barrel of pickles. "That's her," one said, her voice a low, carrying hiss. "McGraw's mail-order bride. Paid a pretty penny for her, I hear." "Looks fragile," the other sniffed. "An Eastern doll. She won't last the winter." The words struck her like stones. A mail-order bride, a purchased commodity. It was a crude, ugly label. But in its essence, wasn't it true the lie of the bookkeeper position had been stripped away, leaving only the stark transaction? She felt a hot blush creep up her neck. Colt, who seemed to hear everything, finished his business and placed a firm hand on the small of her back, guiding her out of the store. He didn't acknowledge the comments, but his jaw was set like granite, and he didn't speak a word on the long ride back to the ranch. Mary Louise's inner world became a battlefield. One part of her, the fragile girl from Massachusetts, was terrified. She was afraid of the snakes she was told hid in the tall grass, of the howling of coyotes at night, of the crushing loneliness, and of the hard, silent man to whom she was now bound. She was terrified of her own incompetence. But another part of her was stirring, a stubborn, resilient core she never knew she possessed. It was a flicker of defiance that grew with every condescending look from Jed Boone, every failed recipe, every silent rejection from Abigail. She would not break. She would not be the Eastern doll who wouldn't last the winter. She would learn to conquer the stove. She would learn to bake bread that was light and fluffy. She would learn the names of the horses and the rhythms of the ranch. She would survive this place, if only to spite everyone who believed she couldn't. The change came not in a single, triumphant moment, but in a series of small, hard-won victories. The day a biscuit turned out edible. The first time the milk cow stood patiently for her. The afternoon Jed Boone gave a grudging nod of approval after tasting her stew. These were tiny footholds on the mountain she was climbing. The turning point, the moment the ground shifted beneath her feet, arrived with the fury of the sky itself. It had been a hot, breathless day. The air was thick and heavy, and a strange, yellow light had settled over the plains. By late afternoon, the sky to the west had bruised to a dark purple gray. The wind began to rise, not in gusts, but in a steady, mournful moan that rattled the window panes. "Storm's coming," Colt announced, striding into the house. "A bad one." The world outside grew dark. The first drops of rain were as large as coins, splattering in the dust. Within minutes, the rain was a torrential, horizontal sheet driven by a howling gale. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening explosion that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Mary Louise stood at the window, watching the landscape disappear into a swirling gray chaos, her heart pounding in time with the storm. She saw Abigail huddled in a chair by the hearth, the rag doll clutched to her chest, her small face pale with fear. Suddenly, the back door flew open with a violent crash. Colt stood there, drenched and wrestling with the wind. "The north stable door's been torn from a hinge," he yelled over the roar. "It'll take the whole wall with it if I can't secure it. I need help." Jed and the other hands were out on the range. trying to drive a herd of cattle into a sheltered coulee before the storm hit. There was no one else. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Mary Louise, but seeing the raw urgency on Colt's face, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy oilskin coat from a peg and followed him out into the maelstrom. The force of the wind was staggering. It tore the breath from her lungs and tried to rip the coat from her body. The rain was like icy needles against her face. She stumbled through the thick, sucking mud toward the stable, guided only by Colt's broad silhouette. The scene at the stable was chaos. The huge wooden door, a massive slab of timber, was swinging wildly on its one remaining hinge, slamming against the stable wall with a sickening boom that punctuated the thunder. With every impact, the timber frame of the building groaned in protest. Splinters flew into the air. "I need you to hold the lantern," Colt shouted, handing her a storm lantern he'd lit inside. "And keep back." He fought his way to the door, trying to get a rope around it to lash it to a post. But the wind was a malevolent, living entity. It caught the door and slammed it shut, nearly catching him. He staggered back, cursing into the gale. Mary Louise watched, her knuckles white where she gripped the lantern. The light cast wild, dancing shadows. She could see the strain in his body, the desperate fight against a power far greater than himself. The wall was beginning to splinter. If it went, the horses inside would be lost. He was going to fail. The thought was a cold certainty. He couldn't do it alone. Without thinking, she set the lantern down in a sheltered corner and picked up the end of the heavy rope he had dropped. "What do you need me to do?" she screamed, the wind snatching the words from her mouth. He turned, his face a mask of shock in the flickering light. For a second, he looked like he was about to order her back to the house, but he saw the look in her eyes, not fear, but a grim, unfamiliar resolve. "When I get the door pushed back against the frame, you have to help me pull the rope tight around that main post," he yelled, pointing. "Pull with everything you've got." He put his shoulder to the door, his boots sliding in the mud as he strained against the colossal force of the wind. Inch by agonizing inch, he forced the door back toward the frame. Now he roared. Mary Louise looped the rope around the post and pulled. She dug her heels into the mud, the coarse rope biting into her soft hands. She felt her muscles scream in protest, a fire in her arms and back. For a moment, she thought the wind would win, that it would rip the rope from her grasp and her from her feet. She held on, closing her eyes and pulling with a strength born of pure desperation. She felt Colt's hands beside hers on the rope, adding his strength to her own. Together, they held the line taut as he expertly knotted it, his movements swift and sure even in the heart of the storm. He looped it again, cinching it tight, and then again. Finally, the door was secure, groaning and straining against its bonds, but holding. They stood there for a long moment in the relative shelter of the stable wall, chests heaving, soaked to the skin. The roar of the storm seemed to recede, replaced by the sound of their own ragged breathing. The lantern cast a small, golden circle of light around them, a tiny island of calm in the midst of chaos. Mary Louise looked down at her hands. They were raw and red, already beginning to blister. She had never known such pain, or such a profound sense of accomplishment. She looked up and met Colt's gaze. His face was streaked with rain and mud, his hair plastered to his forehead, and in his eyes, for the first time, she saw something other than pragmatic assessment or weary resignation. It was a look of raw, unguarded surprise, a flicker of respect. It was as if he were seeing her, truly seeing her, for the very first time, not as an Eastern doll, not as a mail-order bride, but as the woman who had stood with him in the storm. In that shared look, under the howl of the Wyoming wind, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't love. Not yet. It was something more elemental, a fragile thread of partnership, spun in a moment of shared struggle, a silent acknowledgement that, in this wild and unforgiving place, They might just need each other to survive. The storm broke more than just the stable door. It broke the brittle silence that had defined the McGraw Ranch house. In the quiet, rain-washed morning that followed, a new awareness existed between its inhabitants. The cowboys looked at Mary Louise differently as she served them breakfast, her hands bandaged and clumsy. Jed Boone's customary smirk was absent, replaced by a non-committal grunt that was, for him, the equivalent of a sonnet. Later that day, as she was trying to sweep the porch with her aching arms, Colt appeared with a small jar of a dark, pungent salve. He took the broom from her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers, sending a jolt of warmth through her. "Jed's mixture," he said, his voice a low rumble. "For rope burns and blisters. Give me your hands." She obeyed, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. He sat her down on the porch steps and, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged exterior, he carefully unwrapped the crude bandages and applied the cool balm to her raw skin. He worked in complete silence, his focus absolute. Mary Louise watched the way his dark head was bent to his task, the concentration in the lines around his eyes. It was the most intimate gesture she had ever shared with a man, a simple act of care that felt more profound than 1,000 pretty words. When he was done, he wrapped her hands in clean linen strips, his movements deft and sure. "Thank you," she whispered. He only nodded, his gaze lingering on her face for a beat longer than necessary before he stood and walked away, leaving her with tingling hands and a tumultuous heart. The first true ray of light, however, came not from Colt, but from his niece. A few days after the storm, Mary Louise found a single, bright blue wildflower placed carefully beside her plate at the breakfast table. She looked up and saw Abigail watching her from the doorway, her expression as solemn as ever. But she didn't run. She held Mary Louise's gaze for a moment before disappearing back into the shadows of the house. It was a truce, a fragile offering. Mary Louise knew she had to build on it carefully. She had brought one book with her from the East, a treasured volume of Grimm's fairy tales, its leather cover worn smooth by her own childhood hands. That afternoon, she sat in one of the armchairs by the cold hearth and began to read aloud, her voice soft and even. She didn't address Abigail, pretending to read only for herself. She read of clever girls and enchanted forests, of wicked queens and brave princes. For 20 minutes, there was no response. Then, she sensed a presence. Abigail was standing by the far end of the long dining table, half hidden, listening. Mary Louise didn't acknowledge her, but her voice grew a little warmer, her storytelling a little more animated. The next day, Abigail sat on the floor at the far side of the room. The day after that, she was a few feet closer. Finally, a week into the ritual, after Mary Louise had finished the story of Hansel and Gretel, a tiny voice emerged from the silence. Can they get lost again?" Abigail asked. Mary Louise's heart swelled. She looked down at the little girl, who was now sitting near her feet, clutching her rag doll. "Well, the story is over, but there are other stories. Would you like that?" Abigail gave a small, shy nod. "This book is full of them," Mary Louise said, touching the cover. "Full of words. Once you know your letters, you can read them all for yourself, any time you wish." And so, the lessons began. Using the fairy tales as their primer, Mary Louise drew letters in a tray of flour on the kitchen table. A was for apple, B was for bread. C was for the brave cat in Puss in Boots. Abigail was a quick, thirsty learner. The focused work of the lessons gave her a purpose, and the stories gave her an escape. For the first time since Mary Louise's arrival, the house was filled with the sound of a child's tentative laughter. Colt would often stand in the doorway of his office, or pause on his way in from the range, watching them. He would listen to Mary Louise's patient voice and Abigail's halting attempts to sound out a word, and a complex emotion would flicker in his eyes. He saw the gentle kindness she possessed, the nurturing spirit that was coaxing his niece out of her silent grief. He began to see that the woman he had brought here was more than just a solution to a practical problem. The lie of the letter had, by some strange alchemy, produced a truth he hadn't dared to hope for. But this budding warmth was shadowed by a deep-seated fear, the ghost of his first wife. Sarah was a constant presence. She had been born and raised in this country, a fearless horsewoman who could ride as well as any man. One crisp autumn afternoon, her favorite gelding had been spooked by a rattlesnake. They had found her at the bottom of a ravine, her neck broken. The horse had stood watch, uninjured. The accident had hollowed something out of Colt, leaving behind a core of guilt and terror. He had loved Sarah's wild spirit, and that very spirit had led to her death. Now, when he looked at Mary Louise so much more delicate, so unfamiliar with the dangers of this land, a cold dread would seize him. Every time she stepped out onto the porch, he felt a phantom unease. He found himself directing Jed to give her the gentlest mare from the stables for her riding lessons, an animal so placid it was practically asleep on its feet. His desire to protect her manifested as distance. By keeping his heart guarded, he believed he could keep her safe from the kind of love that he associated with catastrophic loss. Mary Louise felt this emotional ebb and flow as a constant, unnerving current. There were moments a shared glance over the dinner table, his hand brushing hers as he passed her a cup that were charged with unspoken tenderness. But they were always followed by days of cool, polite distance, when he would retreat behind his wall of stoicism. For Mary, whose life had been a lesson in abandonment, this push and pull was a quiet torture. She mistook his fear for regret. She lay awake at night, convinced he was tallying her shortcomings, deciding that his desperate gamble had been a mistake, and that one day she would find her trunk packed and waiting by the door. This fragile, complicated peace was shattered by the arrival of Silas Kane. They encountered him in Red Mesa. Kane's ranch bordered the northern edge of McGraw's property. He was a man who had grown rich quickly, some said by means that weren't entirely scrupulous. He was Colt's opposite in every way, where Colt was quiet strength. Kane was loud ambition. He was handsome in a slick, predatory way, with dark, restless eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. He cornered them outside the general store. "McGraw," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too friendly. "Just the man I wanted to see." He tipped his hat to Mary Louise, his eyes lingering on her with an appreciative insolence that made her skin crawl. "And this must be the new lady of the house. A pleasure, ma'am. Silas Kane." "Kane," Colt said, his voice flat. He made no move to introduce Mary Louise, a deliberate omission. Still thinking about my offer for the North Strip, Kane pressed on, undeterred. "A direct trail to the railroad would save me a week on my cattle drive. I'm prepared to be more than generous." "The answer is the same as it was last month," Colt said, his voice dropping into a dangerously quiet register. "My land is not for sale." Kane's smile tightened. He turned his full attention back to Mary Louise. "A stubborn man, your husband. But then, I suppose he has to be, to hold on to such a fine property." He let the word hang in the air, his meaning clear. An unfamiliar possessiveness, hot and fierce, surged through Colt. He saw the discomfort on Mary Louise's face, the way she shrank slightly from Kane's oily charm. Without a word, he placed his hand firmly on the small of her back. It was not the gentle guidance of before. It was a clear, unmistakable claim. "Our business is concluded, Kane," Colt said, his eyes as hard and cold as iron. He guided Mary Louise away, leaving Silas Kane standing on the boardwalk, a look of thwarted anger on his handsome face. The ride back to the ranch was thick with a new kind of tension. Colt was silent, his jaw clenched, his hands tight on the reins. Mary Louise was just as quiet, shaken by the encounter. Kane had looked at her like she was a prize to be won, And worse, he had made her feel like one. But Colt's reaction, that sudden, silent declaration of ownership, was just as unsettling. It was the first time he had acted not as her benefactor, but truly as her husband. The unspoken arrangement between them had suddenly been dragged into the light, defined not by them, but by the challenge of another man. The silent jealousy radiating from Colt was a terrifying, thrilling thing, a sign that perhaps, beneath his fear and grief, something deeper was taking root. A few evenings later, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Abigail came running to Mary Louise, her face alight with excitement. She grabbed Mary's hand, her small fingers warm and trusting, and pulled her toward the creek bed behind the barn. Tucked away in a thicket of wild roses, almost invisible, was a small, perfectly constructed nest. Inside lay 4 delicate, sky-blue eggs. "A mourning dove's," Abigail whispered, her voice filled with reverence. "Aren't they beautiful?" They were the color of hope, of endless sky, of new beginnings. Very carefully, Abigail reached into the nest and picked one of the eggs up. She turned and placed it gently into Mary Louise's palm. It was smooth, cool, and surprisingly solid, a fragile vessel containing the promise of life. "For you," Abigail said simply. Mary Louise felt tears prick her eyes. It was the most precious gift she had ever received. It was acceptance. It was love, in its purest, most innocent form. She closed her hand around it, as if she could absorb its warmth and its promise into her very being. That evening, she stood on the front porch alone, the egg still cradled carefully in her hand. She watched the last sliver of the sun dip below the horizon, plunging the vast plains into a deep, velvety darkness. The land was still immense, still wild, and still frightening. The shadows were deep, and men like Silas Kane lurked within them. The man inside the house was a fortress of unspoken grief, and her own heart was a landscape of old fears. But holding the egg, she felt a profound shift inside her. The fear was still there, but it was no longer the only thing. Here, in this savage, beautiful land, she had fought a storm and won. She had earned a man's respect, and she had been given the trust of a broken-hearted child. This was not the life she had imagined, but it was a life she was building with her own blistered, healing hands. Looking out at the encroaching night, she felt not despair, but a quiet, fierce resolve. Hope, she realized, was not a grand, romantic gesture. It was something small and fragile, the color of a prairie sky, a gift to be held gently and protected with all her might. The sky had turned the color of a fresh bruise, and the wind was a living thing. It came not with rain, but with the land itself, a scouring, blinding gale that lifted the red topsoil of Wyoming and flung it across the plains. It was a storm of dust and grit that clawed at the eyes, choked the lungs, and erased the horizon, leaving only a swirling, suffocating world of reddish-brown. For 10 hours, they had been caught in its teeth, a small herd of yearlings, spooked by a lightning strike from a dry storm cell the night before, had broken through a fence line and scattered into the Badlands. By the time the dust storm rolled in, Colt, Jed, and 2 other hands were miles from the ranch, and Mary Louise had been with them. She had insisted on coming. She was still a novice on horseback, but she was learning, and her eyes were sharp. It was she who had spotted the faint tracks leading into a narrow, winding arroyo. Colt had been reluctant, his instinct to keep her safe warring with the urgent need for every available rider. The urgency had won. Now, trapped in the howling chaos, he cursed his decision. Mary Louise rode beside him, a small, determined figure hunched in the saddle. She had tied her scarf across her nose and mouth, but it was a poor filter against the relentless grit. Her shoulders, which she had held so straight that morning, were slumped with a weariness that went beyond muscle. She was swaying with the motion of her horse, her body a dead weight, several times. Colt had reached out, his hand steadying her arm, a silent question in his eyes. Each time, she had straightened her spine and given a small, jerky nod, refusing to surrender. They found the last of the calves huddled in the lee of a rock outcropping just as the sun was beginning to bleed away behind the curtain of dust. By the time they had driven the exhausted animals back toward the main herd and handed them over to Jed, night had fallen completely. The wind still shrieked, a high, lonely sound that seemed to worm its way into the soul. "Jed, get the boys and the herd back to the south pasture." Colt's voice was a raw, gravelly command, barely audible over the gale. "Don't stop for anything. I'm taking Mary Louise straight back to the house." Jed nodded, his face a ghostly, dust-caked mask in the gloom. "You sure? Boss, that mare she's on is about done in." "We'll make it," Colt said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The ride back to the ranch house was a waking nightmare. Mary Louise's placid mare stumbled, its head hanging low. Colt dismounted, his own powerful stallion still fresh, and put Mary Louise onto its saddle. He then took the reins of both horses and began to walk, leading them through the disorienting darkness, his own body acting as a shield against the worst of the wind. Mary Louise was barely conscious. She clung to the saddle horn, her world narrowed to the broad, dark shape of the man walking before her and the relentless, screaming wind. She felt every jarring step in her bones. The exhaustion was a heavy, leaden cloak, pulling her down into a dark, dreamless place. When the faint, yellow light of the ranch house windows finally pricked the gloom, she could have wept with relief. Colt led the horses into the barn, his movements economical and sure even in his own state of fatigue. He uncinched her saddle and, without a word, reached up. She practically fell into his arms, her legs having lost all strength. He held her for a moment, her slight weight almost nothing against his solid frame. Her face was buried against his chest, and she could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart through his dusty shirt. He carried her from the barn to the house, the wind making a final, furious attempt to tear them apart. He kicked the door open and then shut, and suddenly there was silence. A blessed, profound silence, broken only by the crackle of a well-tended fire in the hearth and the distant, muffled howl of the storm. The warmth of the room was a shock. It enveloped her, making her shiver uncontrollably as the deep-seated chill began to leave her bones. Colt set her down gently in the large leather armchair by the fire, her body slumping into its depths. The house was quiet. Abigail, thank God, was already asleep in her room, a fact for which Mary Louise was immensely grateful. She didn't have the strength to be a mother tonight. Colt moved to the sideboard and poured a small measure of whiskey into a glass, adding a splash of water. He knelt before her and held it to her lips. "Drink this," he commanded softly, slowly. The fiery liquid burned a trail down her raw throat, but it sent a welcome wave of heat through her veins. She coughed, and he steadied the glass with his hand. His fingers were rough against her chin, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He took the scarf from her face, his knuckles brushing her cheek, and used his thumb to wipe away a smear of mud and dust from her skin. He rose and stoked the fire, adding another log. The flames leaped, casting dancing shadows across the room, illuminating his face. He looked as weary as she felt. His features were stark, carved by exhaustion, his eyes shadowed and deep. He had shed his coat and vest, and his shirt was stained with sweat and dirt. He looked raw, elemental, a man stripped down to his essential self by the storm. He returned to kneel before her again, this time with a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. He took her hands chapped, blistered, and filthy, and began to wash them with a tenderness that made a lump form in her throat. He cleaned the grime from beneath her nails, his movements patient and methodical. She watched him, her vision blurry with unshed tears. The simple, domestic act was unbearably intimate, in this quiet, fire-lit room, with the world raging outside. They were completely alone, the man and woman of this house. The pretense of their practical arrangement felt thin and transparent, burned away by the day's shared hardship. He was no longer just her protector or the ranch owner. He was the man who had walked through a storm to bring her home. When her hands were clean, he didn't let them go. He held them cupped in his own, his thumbs stroking the back of her palms. He looked up, his stormy gray eyes meeting hers in the flickering light. The silence in the room deepened, becoming heavy with all the things they had never said. She saw the exhaustion in his face, but she also saw something else, something deeper and more vulnerable than she had ever seen before. It was a look of profound concern, of possession, of a feeling that had no name, and it terrified her. Her entire life had been a series of losses. Her parents, her home, her future. She had learned the hard way that to lean on someone was to invite the pain of their eventual departure. This man, with his quiet strength and unexpected gentleness, was becoming dangerously important to her. The thought of giving him her trust, her heart, only to have it taken away or broken, was a fear more potent than any storm. A violent tremor ran through her body, a delayed reaction to the cold and the fear and the overwhelming emotion of the moment. She tried to pull her hands away, a panicked, instinctual retreat. "Mary," he said, his voice a low whisper. He held her hands fast. Tears finally spilled over, tracking clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "Please," she choked out, the word barely audible. She was begging, though for what? She wasn't sure. For him to let her go, for him to hold on forever. He misunderstood the source of her fear. He saw her trembling, her wide, terrified eyes, and his own face clouded with a pain that looked like self-recrimination. He thought she was afraid of him, of what this moment might lead to. She saw the shift in his expression, and her panic intensified. This was it. This was the moment he would pull away, retreat back behind his walls, leaving her alone again in the cold. "Don't hurt me," she pleaded, the words torn from the deepest, most wounded part of her soul. It wasn't a plea against a physical act. It was a prayer against a broken heart, against being cast aside, against being found wanting. "Don't add to the wreckage of my life. Don't make me love you and then leave me." Colt's expression softened. The pain cleared from his eyes, replaced by a wave of understanding so deep, so absolute, that it stole her breath. He finally saw. He saw past her physical exhaustion to the spiritual weariness beneath. He saw the scared, orphaned girl who had been hurt by life time and time again. He leaned closer, his voice the softest she had ever heard it, a vow made in the heart of the storm. "Only love touches you tonight." The words settled over her, a warm, weighted blanket against the cold fear. They were a promise, an answer to a prayer she hadn't even known how to speak. The tension in her body dissolved, and a sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her. He released one of her hands and gently cupped her face, his thumb stroking her tear-streaked cheek. "Mary Louise," he said, speaking her full name for the first time. "Look at me." She met his gaze. The firelight danced in his eyes, and in their depths. She saw the walls he had built around his heart finally, irrevocably, crumbling. "I have hurt you," he said, his voice thick with regret. "Not with my hands, but with my silence, with my distance. I brought you here with a lie, and then I kept you at arm's length. I was a coward." "No," she whispered. "Yes," he insisted. "My wife, Sarah, I loved her. When I lost her, I swore I would never let myself feel that way again. I thought if I kept my heart locked away, I couldn't lose anyone else. I thought I could protect you by not caring." He gave a short, mirthless laugh. "I was a fool, watching you with Abigail, seeing you teach her, seeing you bring laughter back into this house, watching you stand with me in the storm. Your hands all torn up, but your spirit unbroken. I wasn't protecting you. I was just hiding. Hiding from the fact that my practical arrangement was the furthest thing from it. He leaned in until his forehead rested against hers. She could feel his breath, warm on her skin. "I didn't just bring a woman to my ranch. Mary, I chose you. I sent for you. And from the moment you stepped off that train, so scared and so proud, my heart started making a choice my head was too stubborn to admit. I choose you now. Not because I need a wife, but because I need you." His confession was a balm on every wound she had ever suffered. The fear of abandonment, the terror of not being enough, the deep, abiding loneliness, it all washed away in the face of his raw, honest words. He wasn't going to leave her. He wasn't going to hurt her. She had come to this wild land seeking survival. She had endured hardship and loneliness, and she had found a strength she never knew she possessed. But here, in the arms of this strong, broken, beautiful man, she had found something infinitely more precious. She had found a safe harbor. She had found home. She lifted a hand, her fingers trembling slightly, and laid it against his rough cheek. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a man starved for warmth. The storm could rage outside. The world could be cruel and unforgiving. But in the golden circle of the firelight, wrapped in a silence that was no longer empty but full of love, she was finally, truly, safe. The weeks following the storm were a season of quiet revelation. The confession by the fireside had not been a fever dream born of exhaustion. It was a foundation, solid and true, upon which a new life was being built. The vast, empty spaces of the McGraw ranch house began to fill with something other than memories and silence. They filled with the sound of Abigail's reading, her voice growing stronger and more confident each day. They filled with the easy, domestic rhythm of a shared life, of glances held a moment too long over the dinner table, of Colt's hand finding Mary Louise's in the quiet of the evening porch. The fear that had been Mary Louise's constant companion began to recede, replaced by a blossoming sense of belonging. This wild, unforgiving land was no longer a place of exile. It was home, and this quiet, formidable man was no longer her keeper. He was her husband. The truth of that word settled into her heart, profound and deeply comforting. But peace on the prairie is a fragile thing, as fleeting as a wildflower in a drought, and the drought had come. The relentless summer sun beat down, bleaching the grass to the color of old bone and shrinking the creek to a muddy trickle. The air grew heavy with the threat of fire, and the mood of the ranch hands turned grim as they watched the grazing lands wither. It was against this backdrop of natural anxiety that the first man-made trouble appeared. A fence was cut cleanly in the north pasture, the very land Silas Kane coveted. 30 head of prime cattle vanished overnight. Colt and Jed found the tracks of shod horses, not the unshod ponies of opportunistic natives. It was professional work. "Kane," Colt said, his voice a low growl as he stared at the severed wires. It was not a question. "He's testing you, boss," Jed Boone said, his face grim, seeing how far he can push before you push back. The raid was followed by a series of relentless, gnawing aggressions. A vital watering hole was fouled. A prize breeding bull was found mysteriously lamed. These were not the acts of common rustlers who wanted to steal and sell. They were acts of sabotage, designed to bleed the McGraw ranch dry, to break its spirit and its bank account. The pressure mounted with the heat, a slow, suffocating siege. Amidst this growing tension, Mary Louise found her role shifting once more. She was no longer just the keeper of the house. She was becoming its guardian. One afternoon, Colt found her in the kitchen, staring at the small, decorative pistol her father had once owned, which she kept in a box of mementos. "That's a toy," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "It won't stop a man like Kane, or the men he hires." The next day, he took her out to a clearing behind the barn. He placed a solid, heavy Colt peacemaker in her hand, its weight both frightening and substantial. "You need to know how to use this," he said simply. "Not to go looking for trouble, but so you're ready if trouble comes looking for you." The first time she fired it, the recoil jolted her entire body. and the sound was a violent, deafening crack that made her flinch. But Colt was a patient teacher. He stood behind her, his arms coming around her to adjust her stance, his chest a solid wall against her back. He showed her how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it, how to become one with the weapon. His closeness was a comfort, his instruction a transfer of power. Slowly, her fear was replaced by a grim competence. She learned to load, to fire, to hit the tin cans he set up on a fence post with increasing accuracy. She prayed to God she would never have to point the gun at a living soul, but the knowledge that she could was a cold, hard kernel of strength within her. Her transformation was not lost on the rest of the ranch. The cowboys, who had once seen her as a fragile liability, now treated her with a deep and abiding respect. She was Mrs. McGraw, and she was as tough as any of them. Jed Boone, her harshest initial critic, became her staunchest defender. He saw how she managed the dwindling household supplies, stretching them with a careful ingenuity that kept everyone fed and in good spirits despite the hardship. He saw the fierce, protective love in her eyes whenever she looked at Abigail. He saw the woman who had held the rope in the storm and who now held a pistol with a steady hand. One evening, as she handed him a fresh cup of coffee, he tipped his hat. "Much obliged." "Ma'am," he said, the simple word of respect sealing his final, unspoken approval. The simmering conflict with Kane finally exploded into open warfare on a moonless, windy night. Mary Louise was woken by a frantic shout, a sound that cut through the darkness with the sharp edge of panic. Fire. The hay barn's on fire. She threw on a robe and ran out onto the porch behind Colt. The sight stole her breath. The massive barn, filled with the entirety of their precious winter feed for the cattle, was engulfed in a terrifying orange inferno. Flames licked hundreds of feet into the night sky, and a shower of burning embers, carried by the hot, dry wind, rained down on the surrounding buildings. The main house, the stables, the bunkhouse, everything was in danger. "It's Kane," Colt bit out, his face a demonic mask in the firelight. "He's trying to burn us out." There was no time for anger. There was only action. Colt began to shout orders, his voice a powerful roar that cut through the chaos. The ranch hands, roused from their sleep, scrambled to form a bucket brigade from the nearly dry well. Mary Louise stood frozen for only a second. The city girl in her screamed to run, to hide, but that girl was long gone. In her place stood the woman of the McGraw Ranch. She turned and ran back into the house, grabbing every bucket, pot, and basin she could find. She met Abigail in the hallway, the child's face white with terror. "Stay in your room, lock the door, and hide under your bed," Mary Louise commanded, her voice steady and calm despite the frantic pounding of her own heart. "Do not come out for any reason. I will come and get you. Do you understand?" Abigail, seeing the resolve in Mary Louise's face, nodded numbly and scurried back to her room. Mary Louise joined the bucket line. The heat was a physical blow, scorching her skin and searing her lungs. The air was thick with choking black smoke. She worked alongside Jed and the other men, her movements becoming a frantic, desperate automaton. Take the full bucket. Run. Throw the water on the embers, igniting the stable roof. Run back. Grab another. The flimsy fabric of her nightgown and robe were soaked. Her hair came undone, and her face was streaked with soot. She saw Colt on the stable roof, a dark, heroic figure silhouetted against the flames, beating out smoldering patches with a wet horse blanket. For a terrifying moment, a flaming beam from the collapsing hay barn crashed to the ground nearby, sending a shower of sparks over him. Her heart stopped, but he shook it off, his focus absolute. They fought the fire for what felt like an eternity, a desperate losing battle against a ravenous beast. The hay barn was a total loss, a roaring funeral pyre for their winter hopes. The fight now was to save the rest of the ranch. Mary Louise worked until her arms felt like they were being torn from their sockets and her lungs burned with every breath. She worked beside Jed, their earlier animosity forgotten. two people united by a single, desperate purpose to save their home. At one point, a burning ember landed on the woodpile stacked against the side of the house. Without hesitation, she grabbed a long fire hook and began pulling the flaming logs away, her face inches from the blistering heat, ignoring the sparks that singed her clothes and skin. Finally, as the eastern sky began to pale with the first hint of dawn, the wind died down. The fire, having consumed its fuel, began to recede, leaving the smoldering, blackened skeleton of the barn. The immediate danger was over. The survivors of the battle stood scattered around the yard, leaning on tools, coughing, their faces black with soot, their bodies slumped in utter exhaustion. They had saved the house and the stables, but the cost had been immense. The winter feed was gone. With the drought, the grazing land was already barren. Without that hay, the herd would starve. Cain had not just struck a blow. He had delivered what he must have thought was a fatal wound. Colt slid down from the roof, his face a mask of grim fury and exhaustion. He walked over to Mary Louise, his eyes scanning her for injury. He took in her singed robe, her soot-blackened face, her raw, red hands. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a weary, defiant fire that matched his own. The sight of her, so fierce and so unbroken, tore him in two. A wave of love and pride so powerful it almost brought him to his knees washed over him. But it was immediately followed by a chilling, visceral fear. He had almost lost Sarah to this land. Tonight, watching the flames leap around Mary Louise, he had felt that same icy dread. Cain was no longer just a nuisance. He was a direct threat to her life. Later that morning, after he had sent 2 men to ride to the sheriff in the next county, and Abigail had been calmed, he found Mary Louise in the kitchen, trying to wash the soot from her face. He came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders. She leaned back against him, her body trembling with fatigue. "I'm sending you away," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. She stiffened. "What?" "I'm putting you and Abigail on the next stagecoach east," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, a poor mask for the turmoil inside him. "You can stay with my cousins in Ohio. It's safe there. You'll stay there until this business with Cain is finished." She turned in his arms, her eyes flashing with a mixture of disbelief and hurt. "You're sending me away like a package you can mail back when it's inconvenient." "It's to protect you," he insisted, his voice rising. "Don't you understand what happened last night? He tried to kill us. He will try again. I won't lose you. Mary, I can't." The memory of Sarah was a raw, open wound in his voice. Mary Louise stared at him, and for the first time, she fully understood the depth of the fear he carried. He wasn't pushing her away out of anger or regret. He was trying to lock her in a safe, far away from the dangers he associated with love. "And what about you?" she asked, her own voice fierce and low. "Will you be safe? Will fighting him alone protect you?" She placed her sooty hands on his chest. "My home is not in Ohio, Colt. It's here, with you and Abigail. My life is here. You think sending me away keeps me safe. Sending me away would be the cruelest thing you could do. It would break my heart in a way Silas Cain never could." She looked up at him, her eyes clear and unwavering. "You told me that only love would touch me in this house. Was that a lie, or was it a promise? Because if it was a promise, it means we face the dangers together. That is what a husband and wife do. Your fight is my fight. We will not be safer apart. We will only be weaker." He looked down at her, at this incredible woman who had faced down storms and fires and loneliness without breaking. She was not the fragile Eastern doll he had feared for. She was forged of prairie steel. He realized, in that moment, that she was right. To send her away would be to give in to the ghosts of his past. It would be an act of fear, not of love. Their survival, their very strength, was not in hiding, but in standing together, side by side, against the coming darkness. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her smoky hair. holding her as if he could absorb her strength into himself. "You're right," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Forgive me. We stay together." They stood there for a long time, holding each other amidst the quiet wreckage of the morning. The black cloud of Silas Kane's hatred still hung over the prairie, but in the heart of the McGraw Ranch, two people had made their stand. They would face it together. The fragile peace was paid for day by day with vigilance. Colt moved with the tense, quiet grace of a wolf patrolling its territory. He and Jed rode the fence lines relentlessly, their rifles never far from their hands. The ranch hands worked in pairs, no man ever truly alone. A constant, watchful silence settled over the ranch, the quiet before a final, violent thunderclap. The drought deepened, and the sun-hammered land seemed to hold its breath. Mary Louise tried to shield Abigail from the tension, creating a small, safe world of lessons and stories within the walls of the house. But even a child could feel the fear that coiled in the air like a snake in the dust. Abigail grew quieter, her large, solemn eyes mirroring the anxiety she saw in the adults around her. The blow, when it came, was not a frontal assault, but a serpent strike, aimed at the heart of their world. It happened in the late afternoon. The heat was a shimmering, oppressive blanket. Mary Louise was mending one of Colt's shirts on the porch, and Abigail was down by the nearly dry creek bed, searching for the smooth, colorful stones she liked to collect. It was a familiar ritual, a small pocket of normalcy in the suffocating tension. Mary Louise could see the top of her sunbonnet above the low creek bank. For 5 minutes, perhaps 10. She focused on her needlework, her mind momentarily eased by the simple, domestic task. When she looked up again, the sunbonnet was gone. A prickle of unease, sharp and cold, went down her spine. "Abigail," she called, her voice clear in the still air. There was no answer. She set her sewing aside and walked to the edge of the porch. "Abigail, it's time to come in now." The silence that answered her was vast and empty. The pricking unease blossomed into a cold, sickening dread. She walked quickly at first, then ran, her skirts kicking up dust as she scrambled down the dry bank. The creek bed was empty. A few of Abigail's prized stones lay in a neat little pile, but the child was gone. Panic, raw and blinding, seized her. She screamed Abigail's name, the sound thin and desperate against the immense, indifferent landscape. She ran along the creek, her eyes scanning the sparse brush, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then she saw it, lying half-hidden under a sagebrush, as if it had been dropped in a struggle, was Abigail's button-eyed rag doll. The sight broke her. A choked, guttural sob escaped her lips. She snatched up the doll and ran, stumbling, back toward the house, screaming Colt's name. He met her halfway to the barn, his face a thundercloud of concern at the sound of her cries. When he saw the doll in her hand and the stark terror in her eyes, he didn't need to ask. His face went pale beneath its tan, then hardened into a mask of cold, murderous fury. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip like iron, where he bit out. "The creek," she sobbed, unable to form any other words. "She was just there." He was gone in an instant, bellowing for Jed. The ranch exploded into frantic, organized chaos. Men grabbed rifles and fanned out, their search methodical and grim. But Colt knew. Mary Louise knew. This was not a child who had wandered off. This was Silas Kane. Confirmation came less than an hour later. A lone rider, a weaselly-faced man Mary Louise recognized as one of Kane's cronies, galloped into the ranch yard, reined his horse to a skidding halt, and threw a folded piece of paper into the dust. He didn't wait for a response, wheeling his horse around and disappearing in a cloud of red grit. Colt snatched up the note. His face, as he read it, was terrible to behold. The muscles in his jaw stood out like cords of steel. Without a word, he handed the paper to Jed. Mary Louise read it over the foreman's shoulder. The words were crude, scrawled in pencil. McGraw, the girl is safe for now. You want to see her again. You bring the signed deed to the North Strip to the saloon in Red Mesa. Midnight. Come alone, or the girl pays the price. Kane. The air went out of Mary Louise's lungs. She felt a wave of dizziness, and Jed's arm shot out to steady her. The guilt was a physical sickness, a burning acid in her stomach. If she had only watched more closely, if she hadn't looked away. Colt turned and strode toward the house, his movements stiff with suppressed violence. "Jed," he said over his shoulder, his voice a low, deadly rasp. "Pick 5 of our best men. I want every one of them armed with a rifle and a sidearm. We ride in an hour." "And the deed?" Jed asked quietly. "To hell with the deed," Colt snarled. "I'm not giving that bastard a single blade of grass. I'm going to tear his saloon apart, and I'm going to take my niece back." He looked at Mary Louise, his eyes filled with a pain so deep it was almost black. "You stay here. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me." She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She watched as he went into his office, the place where he kept his guns. The men began to gather in the yard, their faces grim, checking their weapons with a quiet, deadly purpose. Colt's plan was clear, a full frontal assault. He would meet Kane's barbarism with overwhelming force. Mary Louise went into the silent kitchen, her body moving on instinct. She sank into a chair at the table, clutching Abigail's doll. Colt's rage was righteous. It was justified. But it was a blind rage. He was a father and an uncle whose child had been stolen. He was thinking of punishment, of retribution. Mary Louise's mind, however, was a maelstrom of fear and guilt, and through it, a different thought began to form, cold and terrifying in its clarity. Silas Kane was a coward. He was a vain, arrogant man who used others to do his dirty work. He had Abigail. If Colt and a half-dozen armed cowboys charged into that saloon, what would a cornered coward do? He would use the child. He would use her as a shield. Colt's righteous fury could get Abigail killed. The thought solidified into a horrifying certainty. There had to be another way, a different approach. She looked at the clock on the mantel. It was nearly 9. Colt and his men were preparing for war. They saw this as a fight between men, a battle for land and dominance to be settled with bullets. But Kane had made it about something else. He had taken a child. He had made it a mother's fight, and that was a battle Kane knew nothing about. A desperate, reckless plan formed in her mind. It was madness. It was suicide. But it was the only thing she could think of that wasn't a charge into a hail of gunfire with Abigail in the middle. She waited. She listened as Colt gave his final instructions in the yard, his voice low and hard. She heard the jingle of harnesses and the soft thud of rifle butts settling into saddle scabbards. They would circle around, he said, and approach the town from the back, under the cover of darkness. While they were occupied, she slipped out the back door. She didn't go to the main stable, but to the small corral where her gentle mare was kept. Her hands shook so badly she could barely buckle the bridle. She didn't bother with a saddle, simply throwing a blanket over the horse's back and hauling herself up. She was not a confident rider, but tonight, fear gave her a desperate skill. She urged the horse into a canter, keeping to the soft earth to muffle the sound of its hoofbeats, and circled wide around the ranch house, heading not for the back roads, but straight for the main trail to Red Mesa. She had to get there first. The ride was a lonely, terrifying journey through a landscape of black and silver, lit by a sliver of moon. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing rider. She leaned low over the horse's neck, whispering Abigail's name like a prayer, a mantra against the fear. Red Mesa was a collection of dark, sleeping shapes, with one glaring exception, the saloon. Yellow light and the raucous sound of a tinny piano spilled out of its swinging doors. She slid off her horse, her legs trembling, and tied the reins to a hitching post. Taking a deep breath, she pulled the heavy peacemaker from the waistband of her skirt the gun Colt had taught her to use. She held it concealed in the folds of her dress, its weight a cold, grim reassurance. She pushed through the swinging doors. The saloon fell silent. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. Every head turned. 50 pairs of eyes, the eyes of prospectors, drifters, and hired guns fixed on her. The air, thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and smoke, seemed to crackle. A woman, a lady, had just walked into their sordid sanctuary. At a table in the back, Silas Kane looked up from his poker game. A slow, arrogant smile spread across his face as he saw her. He had been expecting Colt McGraw, armed to the teeth. He had not been expecting this. Well, he drawled, pushing his chair back. Look what the cat dragged in. The little sparrow has flown from her cage. To what do we owe the honor? Mrs. McGraw. Mary Louise's eyes scanned the room, ignoring him, until she found what she was looking for. Abigail was sitting on a crate in a dark corner, guarded by one of Kane's thugs. The child was not crying. She was just sitting there, small and still, clutching her knees, her face a pale, tear-streaked oval in the gloom. Their eyes met across the room, and Mary Louise's heart shattered. She turned her gaze back to Kane, and all the fear she felt coalesced into an icy, diamond-hard resolve. I'm here for the child, she said, her voice not loud, but it carried to every corner of the silent room. Kane laughed, a genuinely amused sound. Are you now? I'm afraid you're a little late for negotiations. I'm waiting for your husband. He has something that belongs to me. You are not dealing with my husband anymore, Mary Louise said, taking a step forward. You are dealing with me. Her calmness unnerved him. He had expected tears, pleading, hysteria. This cold, quiet woman was not the fragile Eastern doll he had mocked. He rose to his feet, his smile fading slightly. You have nothing to offer me, he said. I have a warning, she replied, her voice dropping lower. Let the girl go. Let her walk out that door with me right now, and you might live to see the sunrise. One of the men at Kane's table snickered. Kane shot him a look that silenced him. Are you threatening me? Little sparrow. I am telling you what will happen, she said, her eyes never leaving his. You think you know Colt McGraw. You think you've pushed him and prodded him. You have no idea what you have just done. You haven't stolen a man's property, you have stolen his heart, and he is coming for it. He is not coming to negotiate for land. He is coming to wipe you and everyone in this room off the face of the earth. If you are lucky, the sheriff will find enough of you to bury. She took another step. But he is a man. He will bring fire and bullets. I am her mother. I am bringing you a choice. Let her go, and his rage might be tempered by mercy. Keep her, and I will pray that he kills you quickly. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Kane's face. The raw, absolute conviction in her voice was chilling. He had wanted to break Colt McGraw, to humiliate him. He had not counted on this fierce, avenging angel. Empty threats, he blustered, gesturing to his men. You are one woman. I have a dozen guns in this room, and every single one of them is aimed at a dead man, she said. The swinging doors of the saloon burst open. Colt stood there, framed in the doorway. He was not alone. Behind him stood Jed Boone and the dark silhouettes of the other McGraw riders, their rifles held at the ready. Kane's face went white. Mary Louise had not been bluffing. The saloon erupted into a deafening chaos of sound and motion. Tables were overturned. Men scrambled for cover, drawing their pistols. The first shot was a flash of orange in the smoky room, followed by the roar of a dozen guns answering at once. Glass shattered. Wood splintered. Mary Louise didn't hesitate. While all eyes were on the doorway, she ran, not away, but straight for the corner where Abigail was. The man guarding her was raising his pistol toward the door. Mary Louise brought the heavy barrel of the peacemaker down on his wrist with all her strength. The man howled in pain, his gun clattering to the floor. She shoved him aside and scooped Abigail into her arms. Colt was moving through the room like a specter of death, his 2 pistols barking, his movements economical and deadly. He was not fighting for land. He was a force of nature, clearing a path to his child. Silas Kane, his face a mask of terror, made a last desperate move. He lunged for Mary Louise, grabbing her arm, trying to pull Abigail from her grasp to use as a shield. "No," Mary Louise screamed, clinging to the child with a strength she didn't know she possessed. A shot rang out, closer than the others. Kane grunted, his grip on her arm slackening. He staggered back, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder. He looked down at it in disbelief, then up at Colt, who now stood before him, smoke curling from the barrel of his pistol. The fighting was over as quickly as it had begun. Kane's hired guns were either down, wounded, or had their hands in the air. Jed and his men methodically disarmed them. Colt didn't even look at Kane. His eyes were only for Mary Louise and the weeping child in her arms. He holstered his pistols and came to them, his hands reaching out, not for Abigail, but to cup Mary Louise's face. He searched her eyes, his own filled with a terrifying mixture of fury, fear, and overwhelming relief. "Are you hurt?" he whispered, his voice raw. She shook her head, unable to speak, tears of relief finally streaming down her face. He pulled both of them into his arms, crushing them in an embrace that was both fierce and tender. Abigail's terrified sobs were muffled against his chest. He held them, his family, safe and whole in the middle of the wrecked saloon. The smell of gunpowder thick in the air. The battle was over. Justice, bloody and swift, had come to Red Mesa, and a woman's desperate courage had lit the way. The ride back from Red Mesa was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. The moon cast long, skeletal shadows from the buttes, and the night air was cold with the aftermath of violence. Abigail, wrapped in a thick blanket, had cried herself to sleep in Mary Louise's arms, her small body periodically shuddering with the memory of her ordeal. Mary Louise held her tight, her own exhaustion a deep, aching sea she was barely floating upon. Colt rode beside them, a dark, silent sentinel. The furious, avenging rage that had propelled him into the saloon was gone, burned out, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep weariness. But it was a weariness mixed with something else, something Mary Louise had never seen in him before, a quiet, wondering awe. Every few minutes, his gaze would shift from the trail to her, to the way she'd held the sleeping child, to her soot-stained face and the determined set of her jaw. He looked at her as if she were a mystery he was seeing for the first time, a woman who had walked into the heart of his war and, with nothing but courage, had changed its outcome. When they finally reached the ranch, the men who had been left behind were waiting, their lanterns held high, their faces etched with anxiety. A collective sigh of relief went through them as they saw Abigail, safe and whole. Jed Boone took the reins from Colt, his weathered face, for once, stripped of all its cynicism. His gaze met Mary Louise's, and he gave her a single, slow nod. It was a gesture of ultimate respect, an acknowledgement that went far beyond words. Colt lifted Abigail from Mary Louise's arms, his touch infinitely gentle. He carried the sleeping child into the house and laid her in her bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Mary Louise followed, lighting a small lamp beside the bed. In its soft glow, Abigail's face was angelic, peaceful in sleep. They stood there for a long moment, 2 parents watching over their child, the shared terror of the night forging a bond between them stronger than any vow. In the main room, Colt poured 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed one to Mary Louise. She, who had never had more than a polite sip of sherry, took it without a word and drank, the fiery liquid a welcome shock that cut through the chill of her exhaustion. "I was going to get her killed," Colt said, his voice low and raw. He stared into the amber depths of his glass, not looking at her. My rage. It was blind. I would have charged in, guns blazing. Cain would have used her. I never even considered that. He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a humbling self-awareness. But you did. You saw it. How? Because you were her uncle. Fighting for revenge, Mary Louise said, her own voice quiet but steady. I was her mother, fighting for her life. It's a different battle. The word hung in the air between them. Mother. It was a title she had been given by circumstance, but one she had now earned in blood and fear. Colt seemed to hear it not as a role, but as an intrinsic truth. He closed the distance between them and took her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the last of his ghosts recede. He was no longer a man haunted by the wife he had lost, but a man humbled by the wife he had found. He saw the woman who tended his home, who taught his child, who faced down storms and fires, and, finally, who had walked unarmed into a den of killers to save their family. He realized, with a clarity that was both shattering and healing, that the house and the land were just timber and dirt. Mary Louise was the heart. She was the anchor, the center, the quiet, unshakable core around which their lives now turned. You saved us, he whispered. Not just her, all of us. He leaned down and kissed her, not with the desperate passion of the night in the storm, but with a deep, reverent tenderness that was a promise of 1,000 quiet mornings to come. Life on the ranch began to heal. The capture of Silas Cain and his gang was the talk of the territory. The sheriff, a portly, slow-moving man, had arrived in Red Mesa to find Cain wounded and his men disarmed and bound. Courtesy of Jed Boone, the story that circulated was of Colt McGraw's righteous fury, but a second, more intriguing narrative always followed it, the tale of the quiet Eastern wife who had faced down a dozen gunmen with nothing but cold nerve. When Colt and Mary Louise next rode into town for supplies, the change was palpable. The whispers that had once followed her were gone, replaced by stares of open respect and admiration. Men tipped their hats. Women who had once looked through her now offered small, shy smiles. In the general store, the proprietor's wife, a woman who had been the chief purveyor of gossip about the mail-order bride, came from behind the counter. Mrs. McGraw, she said, her voice filled with a genuine warmth. We, all of us, we heard what you did for the little girl. She looked at Mary Louise with new eyes. You are a credit to this town. Mary Louise was taken aback, a flush rising on her cheeks. She had acted out of love and desperation, not for any kind of public acclaim, but as she saw the sincere approval on the faces around her, she felt the last of her old insecurities fall away. She was no longer an outsider to be judged. She belonged here. She had earned her place not through marriage, but through fire. A week after the showdown, the sky, which for months had been a merciless, brassy shield, began to fill with low, purple-bellied clouds. A cool wind, smelling of ozone and damp earth, swept across the prairie. That afternoon, the first drops of rain began to fall. It was a gentle rain at first, then a steady, soaking downpour that drummed a peaceful, life-giving rhythm on the roof of the ranch house. The drought was over. The land, parched and suffering, drank deeply, and the entire world seemed to sigh in relief. Colt and Mary Louise stood on the porch, watching the rain wash the red dust from the world, leaving everything clean and gleaming. The sound was a benediction, a washing away of the blood and the fear. It's a new beginning, Mary Louise said softly. Colt slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. For all of us. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the thirsty land drink. My first wife, Sarah, he said, his voice even, without the sharp edge of pain it had once held. This was her land, She was a part of it. When I lost her, I thought I had lost the heart of this place. I was wrong. I had just closed my own. He turned her to face him. You brought it back to life. Mary, you brought me back to life. He reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out a small, velvet-worn box. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded silk, was a simple gold band. It wasn't new or ornate, but it shone with the soft, warm glow of history. This was my mother's, he said. She gave it to me before she passed, to give to the woman I knew I could not live without. He took the ring from the box and held it in his calloused palm. I sent for you out of desperation, Mary, a lie on a piece of paper. But from the moment I saw you, something else began. A truth my heart knew before my head did. He took her left hand, his touch warm and steady. He looked into her eyes, and the love she saw there was as vast and clear as the rain-washed sky. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. I didn't just choose you for a season, he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was deeper than any passion. A quiet, settled certainty that was the bedrock of a life. I chose her forever. Tears welled in Mary Louise's eyes, but they were tears of profound, unutterable joy. The journey had been long and terrifying. From a lonely girl on a train platform to this woman, loved and cherished, standing on the porch of her home. The simple gold band on her finger was not the beginning of her story, but the culmination of it. It was a circle, a promise of permanence in a world that had always been transient. They decided to have a proper wedding ceremony the following week, not for the town, or for legal necessity, but for themselves, for their family. A traveling minister, a gentle, white-haired man named Reverend Abernathy, agreed to make the journey to the ranch. The day was bright and clear, the prairie renewed by the rain. The grass was already showing hints of green, and the air was sweet and clean. They didn't stand in a stuffy church. They stood in the yard, before the porch of the home they had fought for together. Jed Boone, looking uncharacteristically uncomfortable in a clean shirt, stood as Colt's witness. The ranch hands were all there, their hats in their hands, their faces scrubbed and earnest. Mary Louise wore her best dress, a simple gown of blue cotton she had sewn herself. She had done nothing with her hair, but just as the Reverend was about to begin, Abigail came to her, her small hands full of wildflowers she had picked from the newly revived creek-bed bluebells, Indian paintbrush, and delicate white prairie stars. With the solemn concentration of a master craftsman, Abigail began to weave the flowers into Mary Louise's hair, tucking the colorful blossoms into her braids. It was a slow, careful process, a child's loving decoration. The simple, natural coronet was more beautiful than any veil, more precious than any jewels. It was a symbol of the new life they were all beginning, a crown of hope bestowed by the child who was the heart of it all. When she was finished, Abigail stepped back and smiled, a rare, radiant smile that lit up her whole face. She took Mary Louise's hand in one of hers and Colt's in the other, binding them together. The Reverend Abernathy cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice a gentle murmur against the vast quiet of the prairie. But Mary Louise barely heard the words. She was looking at Colt, at the steadfast love in his eyes. She felt the weight of the gold ring on her finger and the feathery touch of the wildflowers in her hair. She felt the trusting warmth of Abigail's small hand holding hers. This was her place. This was her family. This was her forever. Time in the West is measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the turning of the seasons. It is a slow, powerful rhythm of thaw and bloom, of scorching sun and biting frost. 4 seasons passed, and then 4 more, and the McGraw Ranch was not just reborn, but remade. The black, skeletal ruin of the old hay barn was gone, replaced by a new one, larger and stronger, its fresh-cut timber smelling of pine and promise. The pastures, healed by the rains and managed by Colt's careful husbandry, were lush and green, supporting a herd that was now larger and healthier than it had ever been. The scar on the land had healed, and so had the scars on their hearts. The house, once a hollow vessel of grief and utility, was now a home. Mary Louise's touch was everywhere. Cheerful curtains, sewn from bolts of calico she'd ordered from a catalog, framed the windows. Woven rugs, purchased from a traveling Navajo trader, gave warmth and color to the planked floors. The scent of baking bread and drying herbs replaced the stale air of loneliness. The long dining table, once a silent testament to an empty life, was now a place of boisterous meals, of lessons learned, and of laughter. The most profound change was the school. After the trouble with Cain, Mary Louise had seen the hunger in the eyes of the children in Red Mesa, a hunger not for food, but for knowledge. With Colt's blessing, she had converted a small, unused bunkhouse into a one-room schoolhouse. She whitewashed the walls, and Colt and Jed built sturdy little desks and a blackboard every weekday morning. A collection of children, the shy offspring of homesteaders, the rough-and-tumble children of the town's blacksmith and storekeeper, and even a few of the younger ranch hands who had never learned their letters would gather in that bright, clean room. Mary Louise was not the timid, uncertain woman who had stepped off the train. She was a teacher. Her voice was patient but firm, her kindness a steady, guiding hand. She taught reading from her treasured book of fairy tales, but also from almanacs and newspapers. She taught arithmetic by calculating bushels of corn and the cost of fencing. She was opening a window to a wider world for children whose horizons had once been limited to the dusty street of Red Mesa or the endless, rolling plains. She was planting seeds, and the whole territory would one day reap the harvest. And Abigail blossomed. The silent, solemn child who had haunted the corners of the house was a distant memory. At 11, she was a vibrant, whip-smart girl, alive with a confident energy that was a beautiful fusion of her uncle's resilience and Mary Louise's grace. She had her father's stormy gray eyes, but they were no longer clouded with grief. They shone with intelligence and a ready wit. She was a fearless rider, galloping across the prairie on a spirited pony Colt had given her, her laughter carrying on the wind. She was Mary Louise's shadow and her greatest helper in the schoolhouse. Her patience with the younger children a mirror of the patience that had been shown to her. The bond between them was the quiet, unshakable foundation of the family. It was a love forged not of blood, but of shared stories, of letters drawn in flower, of wild flowers woven into wedding hair. It was a love that had healed them both. Mary Louise had come to Wyoming to be a mother to a child who had lost everything, and in doing so, had found the daughter she never knew her heart was missing. Colt watched it all, a deep, quiet contentment settling into his soul. The restless fear that had driven him for so long after Sarah's death was gone. He had learned that love was not a liability to be protected from, but the very fortress that protected you. His love for Mary Louise was not the frantic, possessive thing he'd felt in the face of Silas Kane's threats. It had matured into a partnership as solid and dependable as the bedrock beneath the plains. They were two halves of a whole. He was the strength that secured their world, and she was the wisdom that made that world worth living in. He saw it in the small, everyday moments, the way she'd look up from her book and smile at him across the firelit room, a smile that said everything without a word, the way his hand would find hers as they walked, their fingers lacing together in a familiar, comforting fit. He saw the way the ranch hands, Jed Boone included, deferred to her judgment not just on domestic matters, but on issues concerning the ranch's welfare. Her Eastern practicality and sharp mind, once a source of suspicion, were now recognized as one of the ranch's greatest assets. She had not simply become a part of his life. She had reshaped it, strengthened it, and given it a purpose beyond mere survival. The central truth of their life together was simple and profound. A lesson learned through fire and drought. Through fear and faith, love was not a fancy promise whispered in a manicured garden. It was not a grand, romantic declaration. Love was the calloused hand that washed the grime from yours after a 10-hour ride. It was the steady voice that calmed a frightened child in the night. It was the shared silence of two people standing together against a fire, their wills united. Love was a choice made every single day, the choice to stay, to fight, to build, to forgive, and to hold on. Even when the storms came, it was the quiet, humble, and unbreakable business of sharing a life, one sunrise at a time. One evening in late summer, 5 years after Mary Louise had first arrived in Wyoming, a thunderstorm rolled across the plains. It was a spectacular, cathartic display of nature's power, with jagged forks of lightning illuminating the clouds and deep, rumbling thunder that vibrated through the floorboards. But it was a storm that brought life, not destruction. It was followed by a cleansing, soul-soaking rain that left the air tasting clean and new. As the last of the storm moved east, the setting sun broke through the clouds, igniting the sky in a breathtaking display of color. The heavens were awash in brilliant streaks of gold, fiery orange, and the softest shades of rose and violet. The wet prairie grasses glittered as if strewn with diamonds. Colt and Mary Louise sat together on the front porch swing he had built for her the previous year. Abigail was inside, engrossed in a new book that had arrived on the last stagecoach. A comfortable silence settled between them. The only sounds, the gentle creak of the swing and the drip of water from the eaves. Mary Louise leaned her head against Colt's shoulder, his arms securely around her. She looked out at the vast, magnificent landscape before them. This land, which had once seemed so alien and terrifying, was now the most beautiful place on earth. It was a land of harsh realities, but also of second chances. It had taken everything from her, and then it had given her more than she had ever dreamed possible. "Do you ever miss it?" Colt asked, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "The east, the sea." She thought for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the endless sea of grass that rolled toward the horizon. "I remember it," she said softly, "like a story I read in a book a long time ago. But my life, my real life, it began here." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the glorious colors of the sunset. "It began the day I met you." He tightened his arm around her, his heart full. He looked at her face, no longer the pale, frightened girl from the train, but a confident, beautiful woman whose features were etched with the quiet strength of a survivor. The gold band on her finger caught the last rays of the sun, glowing with a soft, warm light. He had chosen her forever, and it was the single best decision of his entire life. He didn't need to say the words. She could feel them in his touch, see them in his eyes. They sat there, hand in hand, as the colors in the sky deepened and the first stars began to prick the velvety darkness. They watched the light fade from their world. Two people who had found each other in the dust and the desperation, who had forged a family in the heart of the wild. The magnificent, vibrant sky was a silent testament to their journey, a promise that even after the most violent of storms, there was peace, there was beauty, and there was a future, as boundless and bright as the Wyoming heavens. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night, like this video, and give it a little extra support by pressing the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.